Hello and welcome to today's Finextra Research webinar. I'm AI-powered banking stacks, the secret to fraud management. I'm Scott Hamilton, contributing editor for Finextra, and I'm here to lead a conversation on that topic and to explore important insights on it with you, our audience. But before we jump into that discussion with our experts, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, you're encouraged to ask questions, and we'll do all we can to answer your questions during the session. And you'll have a chance to weigh in on a couple of audience polls during the session. You'll also find links to helpful documents and sources provided by our sponsor, MongoDB, available for you to download. What would you do if you signed onto your banking system and found out your account had several suspicious transactions posted, and you didn't know why? Or in a strange development, you saw that your company's account access was suddenly blocked and you had several phone messages from your bank provider's service team, your account manager, and also your relationship manager asking you to return their urgent calls. The question is what, this may be the reality today, but for hundreds of thousands of consumers, business owners, and corporate financial practitioners, the scammers are working really hard to get the upper hand and grab as much of your money, sometimes in small, quiet, incremental amounts, and even to combine their efforts across many bank customers just like you or your organization, and they're getting very, very good at their jobs. A not very well kept secret in the financial world is that fraud is really out of hand. And it just may be getting much worse because of AI-enabled tricks like deep fakes of real people, identifying details, and a well-coordinated plan to sail through new account onboarding, for example. Might be a significant money laundering operation within your bank and possibly your company caught right in the middle of that new account with your name all over it. Now, as these organizations infiltrate yours, they can ramp up nefarious transactions at a quick and alarming rate and at your expense. Or your location and account numbers look legit, so that vendor you work with 3,000 miles away sends their invoice payment on a Friday afternoon, happy that their 15,000 euro bill has been paid. But you never get the money. Later, nobody can figure out how it happened. The service representative working with your account said it sounded like you on the phone, and they'd even set up a video call to verify your identity themselves. And it was you right in your office. The really weird thing was, if the first bank's anti-money laundering team had just asked their fraud team when that new account was being opened, they would have received a caution on telltale signs of the latest scam sweeping financial institutions in your region. Or if that transaction monitoring group at the bank where the misdirected invoice had been sent had talked with their own institution's AML team, they would have known that they'd been targeted 30 days earlier in a phishing attempt from a company trying to set up a new account, and there were key details of that fictitious firm that matched those of that fraudulent transaction. Now, these tales aren't real, but they illustrate the story that's unfolding in every corner of the globe right now and the real-world reality of rampant fraud attacks from every vector anyone can imagine is like a very bad horror movie, and we're past Halloween. It's a nightmare you can't escape, but there is good news. You can escape, and just as the bad guys have lots of tech and troops of people trying to target your personal or business accounts to steal your money now or later, your bank has lots of very powerful new tools they can use to fight back against the fraudsters as well. And today, we'll be talking about that, about how financial institutions are taking big steps and investing in potent new technologies and systems to tackle fraud protection at every level of their organizations, to connect departments together, to knock down those existing silos that guard data from some of the very people and processes that need them to carry out their daily duties in fraud identification and monitoring. AI agents are being deployed at multiple levels of larger organizations and starting to filter through to the smaller ones as well. Their mission is to create a web of stronger fraud protection and greater efficiency too, a mix fueled by better communication and coordination of resources and data insights in ways never seen before. Now, the best financial institutions aren't standing by in the face of the fraudsters. They're taking decisive action to win the fraud war for themselves and their customers. And that's what we'll be talking about for the next hour with our outstanding panel of experts. Luis Pazmino Diaz Financial Systems Industry Principal for MongoDB, and Ann Leslie, Head of Cloud Risk, EMEA for IBM. Luis, let's kick things off with your view of the present fraud and AI landscape for larger financial institutions. Tell us how banks are struggling or dealing well with multiple processes and systems. Departments tackling KYC, AML, and fraud protection, and oversight in disparate and often disjointed ways. How are some leading FIs finding ways to win this battle? How can banks apply a more holistic approach to financial crime mitigation? And how does AI fit into all of this? Luis?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Scott, for having me today. It's also a pleasure to share the panel with Anne. Before answering your question, let me just briefly introduce myself. As principal for financial services at MongoDB, my day-to-day work is based on actively collaborating with our customers in Europe and Middle East, in my case, with solution providers like IBM and with system integrators as well. My goal is to identify the best practices, the use cases where they can harness MongoDB technology to overcome business challenges primarily. And in all the conversations that I have with top banks in my region, financial crime mitigation is always at the top of the list. In fact, our most prominent customers are launching major transformation, and some of them call them anti-fin crime programs, which involves not only an application modernization, but a holistic program that includes, policies, procedures, platforms to ensure the data security, governance, compliance alignments, etc. So coming back to your question about what is the current fraud landscape, well, it's clear that the traditional or the legacy, if you will, architecture is no longer fit for purpose. They were designed to analyze transactions in isolation with no semantical or contextual analysis. And furthermore, they were conceived to just react, after the fraud had occurred, as the ones that you were describing at the beginning. No proactive prevention was possible due to the lack of the real-time monitoring, which was not feasible, decades ago. But today we're living in a world where AI, it's also used in the fraudulent activities that you have just perfectly described, like the impersonation, the deepfakes, in audio, voice. We're also seeing the synthetic fraud manipulation that it's able to violate these multi-factor authentication systems. But consequently, I'm a believer that we need to fight AI with AI. So when considering a modern architecture at MongoDB, we are proposing to be AI-driven by design, which means that you need to incorporate the automation, the advanced analytics, autonomy brought by these agents. But of course, the agents needs to be needs fuel, right? And this fuel is data. And this is why these enterprise data platforms like MongoDB are so critical in these financial crime mitigation programs. Back to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that overview. I know I might have sounded a little bit over the top, but this kind of thing actually happens every single day. And if it hasn't happened to you, audience, it may actually have happened. You may not even know it, but it might have happened, like I said, 30 days ago, and they're working on it with the authorities, but they haven't communicated. I say they, that other department in your organization, and that's why it's so important to have a connection between these. 3 years ago, we would have conversations with financial institutions, and they would talk about the fact that they had it all buttoned down in their AML department or their fraud department. But then I would say, well, do you talk to your anti-money laundering people? Do you talk to your account onboarding people? And they said, oh, no, not really, not very often. And it was really interesting. They weren't connected. These were some large organizations and very smart people. Since that time, it's become much more common to have a unified approach, a holistic approach, as Luis has mentioned. And when we come to you, thoughts you might add to Luis's introductory comments, and then what are the biggest challenges you see from your organization and your work in the field of fighting fraud across so many attack surfaces and vectors? We're in an emerging, it's a crazy time in financial services. I doubt people really understand how many things are changing all at once for a typical financial institution. And yet it's hard to keep up with some of those changes. One of the things we're talking about today, whether it's technology, data, the fact that there are many rails of transactions with others coming with stable coins and so forth. And also when you go cross-border, then can you share the core of your thoughts on, how AI is not just a solution, but as Luis mentioned, a potential new revenue source. Well, this is something you're talking about. Luis talked about the fact that everybody's got AI, the bad guys and the good guys. But you can talk about the fact that it might actually be a new revenue source if banks make the right choices.
For sure. So Luis mentioned to fight AI, we kind of need to use AI. And I'm on board with that idea. The additional dimension I would bring to it, it's a bit like having a disease and bringing medicine to it. You need to use the medicine and take it properly so that you don't end up with secondary effects that actually end up causing you harm when what you really wanted to do was solve a problem. So a lot of the work that I do in financial services particularly, but anything more generally that's sensitive, sort of critical national infrastructure, a lot of the thinking that I bring is around operational resilience and what needs to be true to deliver mission critical outcomes. And in financial services, particularly in the UK, there's a huge, huge focus on avoiding customer harm. So I am in a risk management function now, but I used to be a seller. So customer centricity is very present in all of my thinking. And also because outside of my role, I am a customer and I have experienced firsthand of the frustration and the friction of when banking processes go terribly wrong. I've had the recent experience of going to a branch of my bank that was not my branch, and for whatever reason, the lady behind the counter didn't like the look of me and wouldn't let me do a transfer to Poland because she wasn't sure who I was and said, but you're not a branch member. I'm not taking that risk. And it's that kind of absurdity, right, that really gets in the way of the reputation and the capacity of banks to leverage what they're really good at. It's the small things. Customers actually appreciate when banks can do the basic things supremely well. Accept deposits, make payments. And people who work in the industry know that there is complexity and sophistication behind that. But when we're looking at embedding new technology, we need to be really mindful of not screwing up the experience that customers already have. And for example, bringing in agentic AI workflows, bringing in chatbots, if they augment the experience, yes, let's use them. But if they mess up the experience, if they cause frustration, and if that frustration actually ends up being channeled on social media, for example, where people are venting, but doesn't show up in any of the internal reporting of the financial institution because there's no mechanism for capturing it, that's where things start going wrong. So I'm all for using new technology smartly, and AI is a great example of that. It's about making sure that we're thinking up front about the business outcomes we're looking for across all of the dimensions of profitability, of new revenue streams, of customer experience, of customer acquisition, customer retention, and making sure that we're looking at it across the board. And I think a theme that's going to come out quite a lot, and be careful not to repeat myself too much, but collaboration and real collaboration, like not collaboration that sort of appears in a PowerPoint but doesn't show up in behaviors. These silos that can so easily exist in large organizations, not because of anybody's ill intent, but just because large organizations are complex. We have to find ways of incentivizing people around shared outcomes so that when they turn up to work day to day, the decisions they're making and the behaviors they're showing and the things that they're prioritizing are aligned and reinforcing each other. So you mentioned AML, KYC, the business lines. There needs to be a narrative and an objective and incentive mechanisms that make it practical and desirable for those people to get to know each other and work together and share information and expose each other's blind spots so that the data that is circulating in the organization, the collective intelligence that is there, is tapped into. And breaking down those silos, I mentioned operational resilience. It's often kind of a trope in the industry to say regulation gets in the way of doing business. Maybe. I have some strong opinions on that, but I also feel that in the current context, the regulation around operational resilience is giving a very strong nudge to the organizations who are willing to feel it positively, because it is forcing a different kind of collaboration. And it may not necessarily show up most prevalently on a topic like this, but there's no reason why not. I mean, if fraud gets in the way of making, fraud detection, for example, gets in the way of making treasury payments, well, that is affecting a core critical business function. So leveraging the intent behind that kind of regulation to look at how are we bringing in AI, what dependencies is it creating for us in terms of our relationships with third-party providers? How is it augmenting our processes? How well do we know our processes? How well do we know our dependencies? How well do we know what data needs to be fed in? What does our technology stack look like? And the organizations that are managing to do well on all of these fronts are the ones that have critical artifacts linked to their enterprise architecture, where they have lineage around data, where they have mastery is maybe overstating it, because that's like the nirvana state of technology management, but they have a good grip of certain critical parts of it, and they are honest with themselves about where they're a bit shaky. I don't think anybody is expecting perfection, but the critical capability is knowing what matters most and putting resourcing on that, and knowing where there is some fragility and being good enough at that. And AI kind of comes on top of learning that has happened with cloud. Organizations that are managing sort of the transition and the embedding of cloud technology are finding that if they did that well, the transition to augmenting their capabilities with AI also going well. But sometimes it needs a reset, and the learnings of what didn't go so well around cloud adoption, I'm encouraged to see that the industry is broadly embedding the learning experiences of the past, not universally, but broadly. I'm seeing some positive changes in how technology risk is being managed.
Excellent. I mean, I have to tell you, it's fascinating when you mention, it's like the Hippocratic Oath. It's, first do no harm. Do no harm to the customer. Do no harm to the relationship. Yet there are things you have to do. That augmentation is so important. The communication between teams, it really is like a disease, because as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the organizations that figured that out, that we probably should be sharing this really important data. And this was before Gen AI had really taken root. Now they're facing these, if they hadn't started to put those procedures in place to actually communicate and collaborate, or if anybody hasn't done it yet, it's going to be a real problem, because they are being hit across many different vectors. And Luis, from your perspective, before we're going to go to our first poll in a minute here, but any further thoughts on the current AI environment? As Anne has described, what institutions are doing right using AI? Talk about how they are, something I know you're interested in, emphasizing traceability and context in managing that data. What's being done with databases and database management to help in this regard to reduce that fragmentation, miscommunication, or even missed opportunities to share important data about customers and about transactions?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with all the remarks from Anne. Actually, most of our customers are always having this discussion that they need to operate in a thin line between, being fully compliant, but at the same time not hampering the customer experience. So that's I believe the most the biggest challenge that they are facing right now. And the other thing that also caught my attention from Anne's remark is that the more the more we digitize our financial our services at all, the more we are subject to cybersecurity as aspects that we need to comply with. And actually, one of the latest regulations promoted in the European Union, the Digital Resilience Act with the DORA, promotes not only to be compliant, but also to build a common intelligence across different financial institutions so we can have a common knowledge that can help us to be better as an industry collectively. And actually, one of the things that I came across was that a report from Citigroup where they were promoting a framework called KYA, which is kind of Know Your Agent, mirroring the KYC standard. And the idea is not only to blindly trust AI, but also to have all the safeguards and the overseas systems in place so they will always be under control and in surveillance. But coming back to your point, Scott, well, agentic AI, it's becoming a game changer for financial crime mitigations and in different front lines. So in the first one, the most common use case that we are working with our customers is the real-time transaction monitoring, trying to detect and even predict suspicious activity, but also, again, align to the immediate expectations for the customer experience. The second aspect is continuous behavioral risk scoring. Traditionally we had a once a year know your customer, and now we're moving towards having a perpetual dynamic monitoring risk profiles where they can adjust accordingly in an event-driven way. Fraud detection, I think it's something that also I mentioned, being able to predict what is potential suspicious activity. And what is so impressive about AI is that they can use synthetic data to evaluate any potential what if scenarios that we as humans and in our bias or even as risk analysts cannot even imagine. So that's something that's augmenting our capabilities, right? And at the end, I believe that it's a lot of savings in the processes, right? Like the due diligence can be drastically enhanced by streamlining those manual, repetitive tasks that normally, we as humans are not willing to do. And there will be, we can use an AI agent like a junior risk analyst willing to take all these mundane tasks that can be, automated effectively.
Excellent description. And I would just add one thing that, the human element of this is interesting because humans could probably do a lot of the things that agents are starting to do. It's just a matter of time and how much time it would take and how many calculations and how many different sources you have to look at. So if you can pull them together with an agent or a group of agents that can actually perform a particular section of a task, such as the ones you mentioned, that's what we're seeing a lot. We talk about this all the time. We talk online. People know that everyone's discussing and debating agents. They talk a lot about that from a consumer standpoint or from a retail standpoint, but we're talking internally. This is real ground for improvement because these are areas where you can tie together all those loose ends in an organization once and for all and accomplish these collaboration goals we're talking about. And I think as both you and Ann said, nothing's perfect. It's going to take a while. But once you figure out how to bring these things together in these different disparate sources of information, even if you can go external, as you mentioned, with Dora and with other new initiatives, that was, again, something that many financial institutions complained about when I first spoke to them several years ago, was, oh, great, we can do what we do, but if we don't know what's going on with the other organizations, we're all kind of trying to hide from each other. That's not good either. So there's a certain amount of information that needs to be exchanged so that we can see these fraudsters coming and share information on them. On that note, let's go to our first poll, which is, in your perspective, what is the most challenging aspect of modern financial crime mitigation platforms? Is it security and governing the data there? Is it explainability, that transparency and traceability of all the data you get that we talked about? Is it automating, smart decision-making in real time, or is it modernizing your systems, your traditional systems, making them more agile? Feel free, audience, to answer those questions, and we'll go ahead and move on to our next question while we're waiting. Anne, how do you see banks and their internal departments' collaboration efforts, as Luis just mentioned? How are they doing it? I mean, talk about some examples. I know you've got some examples, and also a few caveats you might share on how organizations, really have to be careful about bringing together disparate data sources. That traceability and explainability, I know we keep coming back to that, but that's a huge issue when it comes into using Some data that appears in front of your face, you need to know where it came from.
Absolutely. So a lot of this is conditioned by the tone at the top and what the organization is sort of driving towards and the pace. So there are organizations, and they're allowed to do it, which is have a very high risk appetite and are writing away certain risks with risk ladders. And that is a practice, and it's acceptable to a point. There are others who are more cautious, more conservative. And the ones that I'm seeing, this is my opinion, that, totally open to challenge, but the ones that, if I was a betting woman and I had to, place a bet on this, the ones that I think are going to deliver better outcomes long-term are the ones who have leadership willing to let smart people work on dull but essential things. So data, the data foundation, the classification of data, the data lineage, everything to do with the architecture of making sure data is usable, interoperable, available, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard work. It is, sometimes it feels like drudgery, but it's essential. There's no shortcut to it. And any organization that tries to shortcut it eventually has to come back and go, we wish we'd done it properly the first time around. So the organizations that have the teams that have executive sponsorship and leadership around them that are willing to encourage them and enable them and empower them to do that work are laying a very solid foundation that will allow them to scale and build. And again, just coming back to that point I made about regulation and compliance, I like to try and get people to take the constraint aspect out of it. People, just as humans, we don't like being told what to do. And that's what regulation does. It tells us what we have to do. I like people to kind of open their chakras to the idea that there might be an alternative frame for it, which is if you weren't being told what you had to do and you were allowed to determine what is a good idea for you and your business long-term to deliver outcomes that make sense to the organization and that serve your customers, what would you do? And in the context of things like DORA that Luis referred to, you'll probably find that sensible security practitioners and fraud practitioners will come back to a lot of the things that are in the regulation. It's good hygiene. It's sensible best practice that's been around for quite a long time. But again, organizations can have dysfunction in them, and for whatever reason, those good practices don't get adopted. So when we're looking at this topic, where it works well is when there are certain habits that get instilled and that get adopted and that become kind of muscle memory. So things like data lineage. Data lineage by default is just table stakes. It requires work, but the organizations that I'm seeing approach this in a way that will deliver sustainably. Data lineage is front and center. The other thing that I have noticed is organizations being willing to show a high degree of imagination about reimagining business processes. They're not taking as immovable how they currently do things. They're thinking about what is it we're trying to deliver? How might we go about doing that? And particularly in the context of something like agentic AI, it could mean breaking up an existing process completely, delivering it in an entirely new way using available technology, not simply slotting AI into an existing process that may or may not be great. And an insight that was shared with me recently by a senior banking executive is that one of the success factors for him is making sure that in those conversations where business process re-engineering is occurring and AI is being embedded, HR needs to be at the table as a absolutely critical stakeholder, because we're talking about reskilling. We're talking about very significant impacts on people's jobs and roles. People don't disappear. Human judgment is absolutely essential. Skilled professionals are still critical, but where they fit may end up being very different. So there's the technical aspect of it in terms of how we're managing our data, how we're making sure that things are interoperable, and also making sure that people remain very, very central to what we're trying to deliver, because ultimately we're serving people. We're not serving agents on the outside. We're serving primarily human physical customers. And the role of people, for me, remains absolutely central to this. So the paradigm of people process technology, if you approach it in a very kind of holistic, wholesome way, it takes on a whole new meaning, a whole new layer of meaning. So the combination of that, I think, is central. It's the data architecture, the interoperability, and then the reimagining of processes with people enabled and skilled to deliver.
Thank you. And something you said, all the people process technology, something you said earlier, this really comes back to me. You said that when someone in these people, they are people, first of all, as you mentioned, and when they are asked to change the way they're doing things, think about all that knowledge that if you turn them off, if you turn one of your people off, they just don't want to be involved. They think, I'm just going to let the system do it from now on. I've heard many, many times about the edge effect of when you bring people together who don't normally talk. You mentioned it at the very beginning of the conversation. You said when you can bring people together who don't normally talk to each other, you start unearthing very unusual things. You start learning things. Everyone learns from that engagement. I think that is that is underappreciated in many organizations, bringing disparate groups together to create some new possibilities together. Speaking of that, let's look at what our audience said about the poll. Looks like 50% are looking, or half the people are looking at modernizing their core systems or whatever systems are involved here. And then explainability, as you mentioned, is super critical. Basically, the other two, take the other part of it, security, governing that data, and then making those decisions in real time. So, Luis, any thoughts you have on those poll responses? Anything to add to what Anne has just mentioned? And if you wouldn't mind sharing some examples on, if you've got a couple examples of AI agent practices you've seen work very well, in the context of how a financial institution talking or listening to us now, how they're going to implement, first design and then implement, scalable systems that are going to work for them, ones that are flexible, that can go across the organization, not just now, but into the future. And then I love it if we can jump into that R word, the regulatory challenges, a bit deeper than we have. The blind spots might be missing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to, I'd like both of you to talk about it. Let's talk with Luis first, and then Anne, you can weigh in as well after that.
Okay. Well, first of all, I've got to say that I really like Anne's point of view of the human touch. And actually, this whole agentic AI story imposes a major behavioral change that needs to be addressed. I'm fully in line with that we need to see AI as a technology that can augment our capabilities and not being subject to be replaced at all. So I believe that one of the most important success factors in any AI agentic project should be to have an AI expert to drive the change within the organization, to making sure that humans are still in the loop, if you will, for most critical decisions, and keeping AI for doing the most, error less, to make it manual process less error prone, etc. So that's one aspect that I wanted to mention. Now, coming to the results of the poll, clearly the modernizing transactional systems, it's at the top and actually is in sync with what we are seeing in the market. And the reason is that, again, as I was saying at the beginning, traditional systems are no longer fit for purpose because they were analyzing things only in a narrow transactional way. And nowadays, transaction analysis should combine the structured information, the transactions, the geolocation, along with unextracted, the contextual information like the biometrical identity, the device involved, some other aspects that needs to be included to have a fully holistic view. And everything should be analyzed in conjunction with the past behavior and the known patterns, but at the same time trying to incorporate this new insight in real time and trying to adjust this profile continuously. So again, it's a complex process that rules-based systems would come up short. And actually, that is why, for example, MongoDB has evolved for just from we begin with just being just a database, what we evolved from an enterprise data platform. And mainly the reason was to overcome these challenges, because in MongoDB, for example, we don't only store data, but also we offer platform services so you can have a contextual search and analyze the data in a contextual way, right? We combine this unstructured information with the structured as well in one single instance. Now, you mentioned also something around fragmentation, and fragmentation is mainly driven by the different types of data that you need to deal with, the different schemas that you're using to maintain them. So in our case, for example, we propose a different model based on a document model, which helped you to overcome these limitations. And the way that MongoDB stores this information is actually the same way that API services interexchange information. So the well-known JSON format that has been widely adopted in the recent years. And the last aspect that I wanted to mention about this modernization is the real-time processing service. Again, as Anne was reinforcing previously, the customer experience, everything should go around the customer experience, right? And we need to keep in mind that all these checks needs to happen in milliseconds, right? As soon as I swipe the card, all these fraud checks and rules and validations should be processing immediately. So the immediacy effect from the customer experience standpoint is a non-negotiable aspect.
Well, you know how I feel about the term, and I'm going to say it here. Thank you very much for that, Luis, by the way. And we're going to come to you in just a second. I feel very strongly about whenever anybody uses the term seamless, there is no such thing. But it's not a bad thing to try to get close. And I'd much rather people just said, as seamless as possible. We're all realistic. We know things don't work perfectly. To tell us otherwise is a joke. But as Luis mentioned, it's getting faster and faster and faster. And as long as people know that things are working in the background, great. But if they don't work, just think what it would be like for a customer to be caught in the middle of all this. You know, they're on onboarding, everything goes great. Then all of a sudden their transactions are being targeted because somebody else came in and imitated them or pretended to be them. I mean, they want answers quickly. They want teams that are joined together, that know what happened, that know what that other department did or what occurred elsewhere. And I think that that's going to become much more common. And weigh in on what Luis had to say, and then your thoughts on the poll. And then, I know you've already done, but a little bit more of the cautions and best practices from your experience. And then maybe we'll talk the Q word. Quantum.
No, sure.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I share your feeling about that word seamless. Because like you, does it exist? But the thing about seamless is that seams are good in certain contexts, right? Seams hold things together. Seams are useful when it might otherwise get very, very slippery. And you can kind of make a bit of an analogy between seams and guardrails, right? So sometimes it's, and particularly in this context, guardrails are a good thing. I read an interesting blog post a couple of weeks ago about agentic AI and coming from a developer. And he was encouraging his peers in the development community to be radically curious about how agents are working, what they're doing, and why. And it's not enough just to observe a behavior or an outcome. It's like, why is it doing that? Are we sure we know why it's doing that? And it just reminded me of a friend back from my college days who kind of said, one of the worst things you can have as a developer is when code works and you've got no idea why. And the danger in today's world is because there's such pressure to ship things fast that if it's working, yeah, okay, commit, let's move on. And the danger is that if we don't know why things are working, if we haven't really got mastery of the code that's being developed and why it's generating certain behaviors, you can't control that from a governance and a risk perspective because you don't really know what's going on. Again, that comes back to culture. As you know, there are organizations that are willing to sail very, very close to the wind in terms of their risk appetite. Sometimes they get caught and things break and things go horribly wrong, and you know, their reputation might take a hit or they might get fined. But we're getting to the point now where automated systems are being used for quite sensitive topics. And that's, you know, we're sort of edging into the realm of, for example, the EU AI Act, which is looking at high risk use cases. And there's a reason that the European Union took the stance that it has, you know, regulating high risk AI as product safety, because the stake in the ground that the European authorities have made is this, if it goes horribly wrong, could very seriously damage fundamental human rights and fundamental human protections. It's not your average run-of-the-mill risk, if such a thing exists. So the degree of responsibility that companies developing AI and users of AI and deployers of AI have is kind of commensurate with the potential that's there. And the need to be responsible about doing this. And it's, you know, one of the kind of core tenets of the work that we do is absolutely innovate. You know, look for the upside risk. When we talk about risk, it doesn't always have to be negative. There's upside risk. You know, you could be surprised by an amazing opportunity and things could go fabulously well. But certain things need to be true for that to happen. And, you know, we've talked about taking care of data. We've talked about being willing to commit to things like lineage and being, you know, committing to ethical behavior and transparency that shows up in technology. So all of those things are kind of, they're being worked on right now, and companies are figuring out their way. What I am encouraged by is the high degree of interest that we're seeing, and not even just interest, like actual behaviors. There's people are committing to this, embedding this into their organizations, saying, okay, we understand there's a business case for being a responsible digital citizen, and the tooling exists to do it. We're building up the skills and the capabilities. I'd almost say there's no reason not to, other than it requires a conviction and a bit of self-enlightenment that it's the right way to go.
You know, thank you for that, and just a fascinating overview that you just gave. And if we really think about this, given that it is such a tumultuous time for financial institutions, really it is, because of the confluence of so many factors that are impacting the typical financial services professional, somebody behind the scenes who's having to make decisions and create what's going to work. We're going to go to our next poll in a second, but I just keep thinking, what better time than now to rethink all this with all these other new developments on the horizon? What better time than to reshape your organization, reimagine it for the future, for that resilience that you need to have and that competitiveness. On that note, let's go to our next poll here. And then I'm going to have Luis talk a little on a topic. But first, we'll, which would be the most impactful benefit of these following listed of using AI for fraud management? Is it automating those cases? Is it enhancing due diligence through having somebody not real, an AI agent by your side, a risk analyst co-pilot? Synthetic data generation for scenarios, evaluating different scenarios, or reducing false positives. We talk about that a lot through real-time monitoring. Now, Luis, further thoughts on what Anne said, and I think it's really good to talk about how you develop an internal champion develops their case to say exactly what Anne just said, what you've been saying, to make the organization understand this is a good thing. There are opportunities here, and it's also going to protect us, that upside risk, and the downside risk. How can they create specific goals, measure their performance in such a rollout?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, yeah, I agree with Anne in the sense that regulations is a topic, it's a complex topic that needs to be addressed. In EU, we are characterized by being always the pioneers in enforcing regulations, which is a good thing. Some might say that it could stiff innovation, but of course, keeping things under control is crucial for ensuring the safe and soundness of our financial markets, which are so critical. So I'm in favor of innovation, of course, but always keeping things in control with the proper regulatory framework. And let's not forget that one of the key challenges from this regulatory standpoint is that these AI systems or models can hallucinate, right? We shouldn't be trusting blindly, and they should be always being monitored and being subject of internal audits and being continuously evaluated. And again, also for the critical decisions, I'm always in favor that the human should be always in the loop. That's something that most of our customers are reinforcing. Even though they can automate as much as they can, always having these overseas of these experts, it's crucial for success. Now, coming to your question, Scott, well, these investments in emerging technologies like AI can be easily paid off by two drivers mainly. First, the substantial reduction of false positives. I think reducing the operational overhead when it comes to processing this due diligence process can be can improve in not only can bring savings not only in the SLAs but also in money, of course, in resources. But additionally, you can make a case for optimizing things, areas like, for example, customer support center, where by using the conversational capabilities brought by LLMs, you can improve the overall customer satisfaction by enabling these agents that can solve and have the context, right? Few years back, when you just pick up the phone and call for whenever you have some problem, you need to explain over and over again, and you need to identify yourself, to go through these multi-authentication factors. But it would be great if you can, again, not hamper this customer experience, making more seamlessly, as you were mentioning, would be great. And finally, one of the things that I believe that AI can drastically transform is bringing savings and the less effort when generating, for example, the reports for complying with the regulatory requirements. There's something kind of manual task that can be addressed effectively. One of the use cases that I really like about using agentic AI in one of our customers is, for example, using graph networks for identifying correlation between entities in a way that we cannot even consider in the first place. So having this capability of connecting the dots and being able to generate the reports effectively and in less time and effort, that's a massive gain that, of course, the internal champions for these initiatives could leverage to keep innovating in this area.
And there are enough examples out there now, I would imagine, that are being shared. I attended a forum a while back where they made a point of saying, it's not worth it. We don't know it exists until you share it. And it was very open between organizations, at least on a general basis. They were saying, this is one of the applications we're testing. This is one of the ones that we're piloting. And the point was, we all are kind of in this together. If we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately. We have to figure out how AI is really going to work and where it's not going to work. Be very frank about it. Say it's not there yet. And on that note, we're going to show our results, but weigh in on what's coming next. Weigh in on what Luis said, and then also what's coming next. We don't want to dive too deep into quantum, but it's only 5 years away probably. And, and it's going to, that's why laying the groundwork now is so important. I think, is because it's coming down the road. But that's just my opinion. It looks like most people agree with you, Luis, that reducing false positives is a pretty darn important thing. And then, of course, having that other side, that co-pilot around with them, and automating some of the more manual processes right now. Those are the top concerns. But Anne, your thoughts?
Sure.
And then we'll wrap up after this. So yeah.
No,
go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we kind of go future oriented in terms of quantum, there was just one thing that I was thinking about when I was looking at the poll results. One of the options that wasn't there was I was struck by something that came out, I think it was a Celland report not that long ago, about the ability to use the mainframe, right? Now, the mainframe gets a massively bad rap, right? Sort of, we're talking about future-oriented technology, and the mainframe is not perceived that way. But what I thought was really interesting was the ability to do AI inferencing on mainframe infrastructure to capture 100% of transactions. And it was something I think you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Scott, which is those small amounts, potentially small signals, that if you're not monitoring 100%, they get lost. And the ability now to take legacy investment, legacy technology, and also bring it into a future-oriented fight against fraud, doing AI inferencing on that, I just think it's an interesting way of blending old and new to deliver an outcome, right? And I think that's one of the ways that I'd really encourage everybody to think about what have we got? What's the best we can do with what we've got? And if you've got your mainframe, absolutely. But if you're all in on cloud, go that direction. But it's just the mindset of what have we got at our disposal? Everybody is going to be facing constraints around resources, and just using that more positively to say, how can we focus on an outcome and leverage the best of what we have? Thinking about quantum, I'm really excited about it. It's a complex topic in that the potential of quantum processing to augment AI in this context. I think HSBC is doing some really interesting work on that, for example, that's been in the press lately. Again, we're talking about another layer of technology on top of existing complexity. Any organization that's already struggling is going to find that even more of a struggle. If organizations are managing to consolidate that technology base and have a clear view of what have we got, where is our data, what are we prioritizing as critical business functions and important business services, where are we putting our resourcing, who are we working with, how are we managing those third-party relationships, what dependencies have we got, do we have accurate, complete, comprehensive, usable, shareable business process maps, do we have a grip on our enterprise architecture? Quantum, in that context, is super exciting. Quantum brought into an organization where things are kind of all over the place and there isn't a high degree of control. That's going to feel very daunting. And what I'm concerned about right now is that you mentioned the timeline, which is like 5 years away, and you can get into a religious debate about when this is going to happen, but sometime in the not too distant future, quantum processing, a cryptographically relevant quantum computer will be available. And it will be available to deliver massively augmented compute, and it will also potentially break existing cryptographic algorithms. I'm noticing a lot of what's being termed crypto procrastination on this topic, which is because it's a little bit far away, it extends beyond the incumbent executive's mandate. Right? Any executives who are currently in position today may or may not be in their positions when this becomes a big problem. And what it means today is that we need executives who are willing to plant the trees, to leverage quantum and to protect against quantum-based attacks, even if they're no longer in their roles. And incentive mechanisms don't always encourage that. So some organizations are being very, very proactive on this, and they're driving community-based efforts and ecosystem-based efforts. I can think of a big Spanish bank, for example. I can think of a big German insurer. And again, the ecosystem approach to, there are certain things where we compete, and there are certain topics where we should not be competing, we should be collaborating, and this is one of them. Shared learning, mutualizing of resources, absolutely, compete on the topics where it drives better outcomes, but where we are talking about a topic that no single organization can solve on its own, the name of the game has to be collaboration.
Systemic impacts, right? I mean, this is a systemic issue. This is not something that one organization is going to face on their own. And the good guys and the bad guys are both going to have it. So let's wrap up here. We've got just a couple minutes left. First, before we go any further, did you have any surprises with this, Anne? And then I'm going to ask you one last question. Any surprises with the results?
Surprises, no. It struck me that I used to do security operations, and this is exactly what I would expect to see, for example, in a security operations center. Reducing false positives, automating sort of case management, it's very mirrored, even though it's not an identical business function. The kind of the meta themes are very, very similar.
Well, I think what's going to come from this webinar, these will be, you can replay this, you can share it with members of your organization colleagues. Once again, we have two of the best experts probably in the world on knowing how this both works in the real world and how to think about how it's going to work in the future and how other things are going to impact on it. But more than anything, it's reimagining. On that note, Anne, I'm going to have you answer first. We're just going to do 1 minute each of what would you prioritize right now regarding AI deployment when you're thinking about fraud specifically in the context of where you invest your money, your time, your people in an organization, or pick one key ingredient that if you were a financial services organization, you want to achieve maximum success from this effort, what would you do?
Finding a way to delight customers and doing the data drudgery behind that. I think I would focus on that. Delightful customer experiences enabled by data.
Great, thank you. Luis, any further thoughts you have on what Anne shared? And then the final question to you, the same thing, prioritizing right now. Let's face it, if you're facing a big project like this, you have a lot of questions you could potentially go down a rabbit hole on, but you need to get started. Where would you start first? And again, any other thoughts you have? Take us home here for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to emphasize the fact that traditional systems are not suitable for this modern world. And I think that's clear. And in the pursuit of these new solutions, I will always suggest to have this data-driven principle by design. Otherwise, no matter how fancy your AI technology is, it wouldn't be effective enough if it has a proper contextual data in place. So that's something that I would definitely recommend. And having the right data would unlock or ease the adoption of modern technologies as quantum that Anne mentioned previously. So that would be my key takeaway here.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, delight that customer through using the data appropriately and realize that what you have is very likely, if it's quite a few decades old or even a few decades, it's probably not going to serve you well. I love that point that was made that layering is fine on some systems, but not on others. And you're going to need to know that. But it seems like you're going to need to know your organization really, really well, first of all. Even if you have disparate data, AI can help you bring that together. And then the final thought is make sure you're making the right decisions now, getting the right people in place because of the legacy that both Anne and Luis have mentioned. This is going to go on for a while, and there's other things coming down the pike. You might as well do the hard work now. I want to thank my wonderful panelists, Luis Pazmino-Diaz from MongoDB and Anne Leslie from IBM. Fantastic conversation today. Boy, I think we could talk forever on this topic. And of course, there will be different topics next week. That's the whole point. This just keeps changing. But for our audience, if you would like to share this, please do. Thank you for joining us today for a great session. We appreciate your time and look forward to having you come to another Finextra webinar in the future. Have a great rest of your week and holiday season. Thank you. Goodbye.